Welcome to Believe in the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk. This program is an outpouring of the ministry going on at Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Here's what's coming up in today's message.
There's always a time and then judgment for the sinners. And Babylon is no exception. But it's always a known time. We always know that there's going to be time before judgment falls. So there's no excuses. So that's a good part of judgment.
In today's study of Believe in the Word, Pastor Dan Shunk takes us deeper into Jeremiah 25, where the prophet sees God's judgment extended beyond Judah to every nation. Babylon will rise as God's instrument, and for 70 years, his people will live in exile. Yet, even in this difficult prophecy, there's hope. A reminder that God's discipline is not destruction, but direction. Through it all, he draws his people back to himself. Let's join Pastor Dan in Jeremiah chapter 25 as he continues his message, Seeking the Good in Judgment.
For 23 years, I've been trying to get your attention. I love it the way Jeremiah says it. I wonder if I have it here nope, I don't. But in the book of Isaiah, chapter 1, verse 18, the Lord says, "Come, let us reason together. Though your sins be as scarlet, I'll make them as white as snow." See, we serve a reasonable God. He wants to give us reasons to come, trust, and turn to him. It is never a surprise. It should never be a shock. But he gives us excellent reasons. I love that. Verse 9, here comes now the proclamation. "Behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, declares Yahweh, and I will send to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and I will bring them against this land and against its inhabitants and against all these surrounding nations, and I will devote them to destruction and make them an object of horror and of a hissing and of an everlasting waste place. Moreover," in verse 10, "I will make the voice of joy and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstones, and the light of the lamp to perish from them." Verse 11, "This whole land will be a waste place and an object of horror. And these nations will serve the king of Babylon," there it is, "for 70 years. This is what we've alluded to for so long, that the Lord revealed through Jeremiah the specific length of this captivity in Babylon would be 70 years. Very specifically. And so he lays it right out. Interesting that he calls in verse 9, Nebuchadnezzar, my servant. This is a pagan king. We have no indication that Nebuchadnezzar knows the Lord. Now, we do from the book of Daniel understand that there does seem to be a reasonable chance that he actually converted and he came to Christ. We see this in the book of Daniel, and we'll get to that when we get to the book of Daniel. After his time of wandering as a beast, it does seem that there's at least some evidence that he did convert his heart to Christ. But even here in calling him my servant, two things. Number one, it shows even the pagan rulers are under God's authority. They're not just some separate, running around out there freelancing it, doing their own thing, right? But they are under the authority, the control of God. He is his servant. But not only is it that Nebuchadnezzar is under the authority of God, but that God is allowing this. That God is making Nebuchadnezzar a tool of his to correct Israel. And we said it earlier, and I'll say it again. God knows how to use sin sinlessly. He can allow sin and the lives of sinful men to intersect in such a way that it accomplishes his purposes. And yet he himself is removed from the sin himself. God knows how to allow the sinner to progress on his own, to bring about a good outcome. Isn't that fascinating? In so many ways, when God judges and chastises even us as believers, it's not that he has to send a circumstance down and I'll strike them with this. No, so often it's God just saying, all right, I'll let them to their own demise. I'm just going to take my hands off and let them choose that sin they've been wanting to choose, and then we suffer the consequences of it naturally. And so God didn't have to do anything other than let us choose our sin. Verse 10, notice in verse 10 it said many, many different events here of life In verse 10, it said the voice of, all of these different things from verse 10 are going to cease and to stop. He's going to take away from them, special life events like marriages, it's talking about here. He's going to take away, it says the millstone. That's the daily economy. It's going to take away their nightlife. It talks about the lamp, the light of the lamp. So the verse 10 really is trying to indicate it's going to take away your daily life, your special events, your nightlife, everything. Everything about your life is going to change. And then finally, verse 11, it says very, very specifically, it's 70 years that they will serve Babylon in Babylon. We just talked about how the first wave of Babylon's invasion happened in 605. That's coming up right now in the very year that this prophecy is being given. And it will last till 536 BC, when that the Medo-Persian Empire are going to take over from the Babylonians. And as soon as they take over, Cyrus issues the decree. We read all about this in the book of Ezra, where Cyrus issues the decree to allow the Israelites to go back into their land in 536 BC, completing the 70 years. Even in the book of Daniel, it's fascinating. Daniel tells us very specifically in his writings, he says, Daniel does, I was reading in the book of Jeremiah, and I knew that the 70 years was almost over, so I prepared my heart to pray. And that's how much trust Daniel had in these words that were amazing. You mean we're actually going to get to go back? 70 years is an interesting time in this regard. It's beyond a lifetime. It's really beyond. Now, look, I know people live longer than 70 years, but the idea is this. If you were 20 years old, if you were old enough to remember getting kicked out of Babylon, nearly all of that generation is gone by the time you're going back. I mean, by the time 70 years is up, you just think Babylon's your new life. Well, this is just what we are. We are this people that we're trying to keep our own Jewish identity, but we live here in Babylon, or we live here in India, or we live here in, modern day Iraq. This is just where we are now. After 70 years, you start to get that impression. In fact, when we already got into Ezra and Nehemiah, we read those books, and we see how low the numbers were that actually would even come back. Only a small remnant of faithful would come back at the beginning until those numbers finally grew and grew. And we read, of course, in 2 Chronicles, chapter 36, right at the end of the Chronicles, it tells us specifically why they would be kicked out for these 70 years, and it was because of their missed Sabbath years. For every 7 years, they were supposed to let the land rest, and they didn't do that. And so that happened for 70 different years. Over a 490-year period of time, they missed these 70 years that they were supposed to not plant, and yet they did anyway. And so God's going to get those years back one way or the other, and so he gets it here at the end. So this is the reason specifically why God chose 70 years. And so we go on to verse 12. Then it will be when the 70 years are fulfilled that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, declares Yahweh, for their iniquity, even the land of the Chaldeans, and I will make it an everlasting desolation. Chaldeans is interesting. Before I go on here, Chaldeans were the ancient peoples of the land of Babylon. Remember that even in these days, not everybody just subscribed to the major nation state that was around them. Even today, it's the same way in certain parts of the world. You go to Iran today, and most Iranians, if you ask them what their identity is, they will not say it's Iranian. They will say they're Persian or they're other things, right? They don't primarily identify as Iranian. That's just a national thing, and it's not that big of a deal to them. That's sort of how it was here in the days of Babylon. The Chaldeans were known as these ancient wise men from a certain region of modern-day Iraq. And so Chaldeans became synonymous as the wise men of Babylon. And so the promise here, verse 12, is I will judge even Babylon after this 70 years. And then verse 13, I will bring upon the land all my words which I have spoken against it, all that is written in this book, which Jeremiah has prophesied against all the nations. And then this is interesting in verse 14, for many nations and great kings will make slaves of them. That is to make slaves of Babylon. Even them, and I will repay them according to their deeds and according to the work of their hands. And so Just because God allowed the human instruments of Babylon to enact his discipline on Israel and Judah, that doesn't mean they're innocent. Babylon's no, young innocent themselves. They're very much guilty of all kinds of sin themselves, and these verses clearly lay out that once the 70 years is done and God has used Babylon to judge Israel, Babylon themselves will be judged. It's interesting here that God allows the sinners to judge, but yet all sinners will be judged, right? On the face of this earth, who is it that should judge? Another sinner, right? It's just, if God's going to bring chastisement through a human instrument, it's going to be a sinner that does it, right? Well, unless we have my wife do it, then that's, no, just kidding. I'm just joking. But it's going to be a sinner that does it. And that's how we justify God's allowing Babylon to have their way with Israel for these 70 years. Okay, but then they're going to get what's coming to them. Notice in verse 14, it said, "For many nations and great kings will make slaves of Babylon." And of course, that is who ends up conquering the territory of Babylon. The nation state of Babylon is the Medo-Persian Empire. And one of the interesting attributes of the way they were made up was they had many nations that made up this Medo-Persian Empire. Even in the name, the Medo-Persian Empire was the Medes and it was the Persians as the two primary factors that came together that ended up dominating Babylon. So this 70 years, it marks Israel's restoration after this 70 years of punishment, but it also marks Babylon's fall to the Medo-Persian Empire, and who had many clans connected with them. And we see that happen, right? In the book of Daniel, when we get to that, we'll see the Medo-Persians come in and conquer Babylon. When we get there, we'll look at that again in the book of Daniel. And so, number one, look, God gives response time. Even for Babylon, God tells them right here in his word, you have 70 years before I judge you. Get right. Get right before this happens, right? There's stories of this happening all through history. Have you heard about Alexander the Great? When Alexander the Great came into Jerusalem, and he conquered the whole world by the time he was 33 years old, and then died in a drunken stupor, with depression, like, well, there's nothing left to take over. And he's hardly remembered today. There was somebody else that died at 33 years old, having conquered the whole world. And everybody remembers his name. His name was Jesus. He just happened to conquer in another way. The story goes that Alexander actually came into Jerusalem, and the priests in Jerusalem showed Alexander the Great the scrolls in which Daniel prophesied that this was exactly what was going to happen, that the Greeks were going to take over from the Medo-Persian Empire in the days of Alexander, and that they would conquer and they would prosper wonderfully. And the priest showed Alexander this, and he let them live. And he blessed them, and they had worked out a deal, and they worked out an arrangement together because they showed him these prophecies from Daniel. And so there's always a time and then judgment for the sinners. And Babylon is no exception, but it's always a known time. We always know that there's going to be time before judgment falls. So there's no excuses. So that's a good part of judgment. Right? Did any of you have a parent that would come home and just all of a sudden you get in trouble and you're like, what'd I do? You have no idea what you did, right? Go to your room. What? Why? What did I do? Right? That is never the case with God. We always know what it is. And there's plenty of time to respond to that. Right? Let's go to the next part here. Verse 15 takes us to another good part of judgment. Here's the next good part. God gives wrath to all the wretched. We've kind of already alluded to that a little bit, right? Not just that God's going to bring a judgment on Israel as chastisement, as punishment, but God's wrath will fall on the wretched. But it won't just fall on the wretched. It will fall on all of the wretched. No one can escape it. Take a look at verse 15. For thus saith Yahweh, the God of Israel says to me, take this cup of the wine of wrath from my hand and cause all nations, that's pretty clear, right? To whom I send you to drink it. Then in verse 16 will drink and stagger and go mad because of the sword that I will send among them. And now God here is clearly broadening the scope of what he's talking about. He's broadening out to see that this judgment is all nations. But it's because of all nations' agreement with Babylon. There's a connection point between God judging Babylon, and now he's starting to broaden this way out to say, I will bring this cup of wrath to all nations. Go with me if you can I don't often do this to you, but turn to Revelation chapter 14 at the end of your Bible, Revelation chapter 14, and it speaks very, very clearly of what we're talking about here. And so I do believe this next section we're going to read in Jeremiah broadens out to what we will end up seeing in the last days. And in Revelation chapter 14, I want to pick it up in verse 8. I'll just read you a little section here. This is during the 7-year tribulation on earth. And in Revelation 14, verse 8, it says, And another angel, a second one, followed, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She who has made what? All the nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her sexual immorality. Then another angel in verse 9, a third one, followed them, saying with a loud voice, If anyone worships the beast and his image and receives the mark on his forehead or on his hand, and he in verse 10 also will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his rage, and he will be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And finally, in verse 11, and the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. They have no rest day or night, those who worship the beast and his image, and whoever receives the mark of his name. So you see here the connection that all nations have corrupted themselves. And we see as we get to Revelation 17 and 18, it's in every way. They've corrupted themselves commercially and religiously in all of the ways of Babylon. Since the time of Babel and the days of Nimrod, way back in Genesis, until the very, very end here in Revelation 14, 17, and 18, we see this influence of the idolatry and the sexual immorality that came out of Babylon that has affected all nations. And just coming back to Jeremiah, no nation, no sinner individually can expect to escape what is due them. All nations are due to experience the wrath of God, as described here as the cup of the wine of his wrath in verse 15. But good news, because you know, if you're a believer, that the cup of God's wrath was drunk by our Lord Jesus just before he went to the cross. What did he say in the garden? Lord, not my will, but your will be done. But before that, he said, take this cup from me. And that's exactly what he's talking about. The cup of God's wrath. He was debating. He was arguing in his head, am I going to do this? Am I going to be obedient? And he submitted and became obedient to the cross in the garden, knowing that what he was going to do was to take the very cup of the wine of the wrath of God and have it poured out on himself. We said in introduction, it's interesting how it fits right here with this, that the only sin that Jesus ever experienced was our sin on the cross. And the only righteousness that we can ever hope to experience is his righteousness gifted to us in exchange for the cross. It's an amazing thing. And this is that we can have this wrath removed. There's only those two options. You have your wrath removed at the cross, or this wrath is yet coming for all nations and everyone. That is the only two options. And then verse 17 here in Jeremiah, we continue. We continue in Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 17. Then I took the cup from the hand of Yahweh and made all the nations to whom Yahweh sent me to drink it. Jerusalem and the cities of Judah and its kings and its princes, to make them a waste place, an object of horror, an object of hissing and curse, as it is this day. And we're going to continue a large section right here of different nations, okay? But I want you to notice in verse 18, the first nation listed is Judah. The first nation that's going to experience this wrath of God is Judah and its kings. And let's just continue the entire list here. We continue in verse 19. And also Pharaoh, king of Egypt, his servants and princes and all his people. In verse 20, and all of the foreign people, all of the kings of the land of Uz. We know that from the book of Job. All of the kings of the land of the Philistines. And then it names all of these Philistine cities. In verse 21, Edom, Moab, and the sons of Ammon. Of course, these are the nations that were on the southeast side of Israel. And then in verse 22, it continues, and all the kings of Tyre, and the kings of Sidon, the kings of the coastlands, which are beyond the sea. So Tyre and Sidon to the northwest of Israel. In verse 23, Dedan and Tema and Buz, and all who cut the corners of their hair, and all the kings of Arabia, and all the kings of the foreign people who dwell in the desert. And of course, every one of these describes modern Saudi Arabia. Verse 25, all the kings of Zimri, all the kings of Elam, and all the kings of Media. Most of these are in the modern day Iran territory. Verse 26, all the kings of the north, near and far, one with another, and all the kingdoms of the earth which are upon the face of the ground, and the king of Sheshach shall drink after them. Interesting end here. This list, I believe, doesn't intend to represent the entire world. It begins in the southeast, and then it goes all around Israel, describing the nations all around Israel in every direction. I believe it's intending to describe the entire world. It began in verse 18 with who? Judah. And it ends in verse 26. The last one mentioned is the king of Sheshach. Sheshach is another name for Babylon. We also pick that up later on in the book of Jeremiah, that it specifically gives us that reference, that Sheshach is just a code name for Babylon. And so begins with Judah and it ends with Babylon. Judgment begins with the house of the Lord. Judgment should always begin with the people that have great knowledge and accountability. That's us, right? But then it goes to the entire world. Everyone is accountable. I believe this ends with Babylon because that's the same picture that we see in the book of Revelation. Again, in Revelation 17 and 18, Babylon is a picture of the world ruling empire of the last days, being last to be judged. And so judgment goes to the entire world. This wrath of God goes to everyone. Verse 27, you shall say to them, thus saith Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, drink, be drunk, vomit, fall, and rise no more, because of the sword which I will send among you. And it will be, if they refuse to take the cup from your hand to drink, then you will say to them, thus saith Yahweh of hosts, you shall surely drink. For in verse 29, behold, I am beginning to bring evil against this city, which is called by my name. But shall you be completely free from punishment? You will not be free from punishment, for I am calling for a sword against all the inhabitants of the earth, declares Yahweh of hosts. And again, judgment begins with Judah, with the people of God. But notice, judgment is sure. It's sure. That's the entire thing. He's like, well, what if somebody refuses to drink it? He says, just look at them and say, you will drink it. It's going to happen. That's the point he's trying to make. It's assured. It's going to happen. And then in verse 30, to continue in verse 30, therefore you shall prophesy against them all these words, and you shall say to them, Yahweh will roar from on high, and will give forth his voice from his holy habitation. He will roar mightily against his pasture. He will bellow a shout like those who tread the grapes against all the inhabitants of the earth. In verse 31, a rumbling has come to the end of the earth, because Yahweh has a contention against the nations. He is entering into judgment with all flesh. As for the wicked, he has given them to the sword, declares Yahweh. So this is clearly a picture of the second coming of Christ when he comes in the fierceness of his wrath. And we see this same picture of him, Christ himself, coming to tread out the wrath of God.
That was Believe in the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk. Even when life feels like exile, when we are far from where we thought we'd be, God is still at work. His plans are always redemptive, shaping us through hardship and restoring us through his promises. Don't lose heart when God allows discipline. It's a proof that he loves you. If you've been encouraged or challenged by today's message, we'd love to hear from you. You can call us at 717-500-1102. Again, our phone number is 717-500-1102. Or visit cchambersburg.org, where you can hear this and other studies online. And if you're in the Chambersburg, Pennsylvania area, we'd love to have you come join us in person. Our location is 5121 Coffee Avenue, Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, 17201. Service times and directions are available online at cchambersburg.org. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to having you with us next time as Pastor Dan continues his teaching through the book of Jeremiah. This has been Believe in the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk.